The crisp autumn morning painted the suburban streets of Millbrook with golden sunlight. The neighborhood was just starting to wake up, with early joggers nodding friendly hellos and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from kitchen windows. On Maple Street, where perfectly spaced trees lined both sides of the road, a young teen was going about his weekend routine, something he'd been doing reliably for the past year. The boy, a high school sophomore with a bright smile and determined spirit, carried his newspaper delivery bag with pride. He'd saved up for months to buy his first smartphone from this job, and now he used that same phone to track his delivery route. His mom had always taught him the value of hard work, and he took this responsibility seriously. Each paper had to be placed just right, away from sprinklers and morning dew. As he walked down the street, his sneakers crunching through fallen leaves, he couldn't help but notice how peaceful everything felt. The morning air was cool against his face, and the neighborhood cats he befriended over the months peeked out from behind bushes to greet him. He even given them nicknames. The orange tabby was Professor, because of its serious expression, and the black and white one was Scout, since it followed him on part of his route. This particular Saturday started like any other. He'd woken up early, double-checked his delivery list, and headed out while the stars were still fading from the sky. His mom, who worked in local government, had already left for an early meeting, but she'd made sure to leave his favorite breakfast sandwich wrapped and ready. That's the kind of thoughtful person she was, always taking care of others, even with her busy schedule. The boy had his routine down to a science. He knew which houses had dogs that would bark if he stepped too close to the flower beds, which subscribers preferred their paper on the porch rather than the driveway, and which elderly residents might need help bringing in their groceries later in the day. These weren't just houses to him. They were part of his community. As he approached the newer section of the neighborhood, where construction had just finished on several homes, he noticed some moving boxes still stacked on porches. New neighbors meant new possibilities. Maybe new subscriptions to add to his route, or new friends to meet. His mom always said that change brings opportunity, and he tried to keep that positive mindset. He pulled out his phone to check his delivery app, making sure he hadn't missed anyone. The morning sun was getting stronger now, casting long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns. The neighborhood was starting to buzz with weekend activity. Garage doors opening, cars being washed, and early morning gardeners tending to their flower beds. The boy adjusted his delivery bag, its familiar weight a comfort against his shoulder. He learned to fold the papers just right so they wouldn't get caught in the wind or damaged by morning moisture. It was a small detail, but he took pride in doing things properly. His mom always said that character shows in how you handle the little things, not just the big moments. Little did he know that this ordinary Saturday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. As he approached one of the newly occupied houses, he noticed movement behind the curtains. Someone was watching him, and not in the usual friendly way he'd grown accustomed to. The peace of his morning routine was about to be dramatically interrupted, though he couldn't have known it at that moment. The air seemed to shift, carrying a hint of tension that hadn't been there before. But for now, he continued his deliveries, humming quietly to himself, completely unaware that the next few minutes would spark a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the entire community's perspective on what it means to be truly neighborly. Behind the pristine windows of her newly purchased home, the woman stood watching, her coffee growing cold in her hands. She'd moved from the city just 2 weeks ago, seeking what the real estate agent had promised would be a quiet, safe neighborhood. Every sound, every unfamiliar face made her nervous in these new surroundings. When she spotted the young teen walking slowly past houses, occasionally stopping to look at his phone, her imagination began to run wild. The morning news she'd been watching, filled with stories of neighborhood crimes, played in the back of her mind. The fact that he kept looking at houses and checking his phone only fueled her suspicions. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. She joined the neighborhood watch group on social media the day she moved in, and their posts about staying vigilant echoed in her thoughts. Without taking her eyes off the boy, She grabbed her phone from the kitchen counter and began recording through the window. The odd morning that had started so peacefully was about to shift dramatically. Taking a deep breath and gathering what she thought was courage, she stepped onto her front porch. The sound of her door opening made the young teen look up, a friendly smile starting to form on his face. A smile that quickly faded when he saw her expression. "What are you doing here?" she called out, her voice carrying across the morning air louder than she'd intended. "Why are you taking pictures of houses?" She held her phone steadily, continuing to record, convinced she was doing the right thing to protect her new neighborhood. The boy's response was remarkably composed. He gestured to his delivery bag and spoke clearly. "I'm just delivering newspapers, ma'am. I do this route every weekend." He even pulled out a paper to show her, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to ease her obvious tension. But fear and prejudice had already clouded her judgment. "I haven't ordered any newspaper," she replied sharply, taking a step forward. "And I've been watching you. You keep looking at houses and checking your phone. I'm going to call the police." The boy's heart sank. He'd heard stories about situations like this from his friends, from his mother, but experiencing it firsthand was different. His hands started to feel clammy, but his mother's words echoed in his mind. "Always stay calm, always be respectful, but always know your rights." Taking a deep breath, he slowly sat down on the curb, placing his delivery bag beside him. He pulled out his phone, not to check his route this time, but to call his mother. He knew she'd know exactly what to do. She always did. The woman, still recording, paced on her porch as she spoke to the police dispatcher. Her voice carried fragments of the conversation. "Suspicious person. Looking at houses. Won't leave. I don't feel safe." All the while, the boy remained seated, his own phone now pressed to his ear, his voice steady as he explained the situation to his mother. Other neighbors began to peek out their windows, drawn by the commotion. A few recognized the young paper carrier, their faces showing concern and confusion at the scene unfolding on their usually peaceful street. An elderly man 2 houses down started to step outside, a look of concern on his face. He'd just received his paper from this same boy not 15 minutes ago. The morning had grown warmer, but the atmosphere on the street was anything but. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. The woman stood firmly on her porch, phone still recording, convinced she was protecting her new community. The boy remained on the curb, his posture straight, but his hands clasped tightly together, waiting, hoping, knowing his mother would arrive soon. What nobody on that street realized yet was that the next few minutes would completely transform their community. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments, and this ordinary morning was about to become extraordinary in ways none of them could have predicted. The police sirens grew louder, their wailing breaking the peaceful morning quiet of the suburban street. The young teen sat calmly on the curb, but his heart was racing beneath his composed exterior. He'd finished talking to his mom moments ago, and her words gave him strength. "Stay exactly where you are, honey. I'm on my way. Everything's going to be okay." More neighbors had emerged from their homes now, creating an unexpected audience to this morning's drama. The elderly couple from the blue house across the street stood on their lawn in their robes, concern etched on their faces. They'd known the boy since he started his paper route. He was the same kid who helped carry their groceries without being asked. The woman on the porch kept her phone trained on the boy, but her hands had started to shake slightly. Maybe it was the growing number of witnesses, or maybe it was the way some of them were looking at her with obvious disapproval, but something was making her uncomfortable. Still, she stood her ground, convinced she was doing the right thing. 2 police cars pulled up, their lights flashing against the morning sun. The officers stepped out cautiously, taking in the scene. A teenager sitting quietly on the curb, a woman recording from her porch, and a small crowd of onlookers gathered at a respectful distance. It wasn't exactly the dangerous situation they'd been called about. The first officer approached the boy, while his partner walked toward the woman. The boy's hands were visible, his delivery bag beside him, newspapers clearly visible inside. He spoke softly but clearly, explaining his paper route, showing his phone app with the delivery schedule, and pointing out the house numbers that matched his list. The woman's voice carried across the lawn as she spoke to the second officer, her words tumbling out quickly. He was taking pictures of houses, looking suspicious. I just moved here. Better safe than sorry. But even as she spoke, doubt began to creep into her voice. The officer's measured questions were making her see how her fears might have gotten the better of her. Just then, another vehicle turned onto the street, a black SUV with official city plates. The crowd of neighbors murmured as they recognized the car. The boy's face lit up with relief, while the woman's expression shifted from righteousness to uncertainty. The morning sun caught the city seal on the car door as it pulled to a stop. The boy stood up slowly, his dignity intact despite the situation. The woman's phone, which had been recording everything, lowered slightly as she watched a well-dressed woman step out of the SUV. Even if she didn't recognize her from TV and local news, the confident stride and air of authority would have given away her position. The mayor, the boy's mother, took in the scene with the practiced eye of both a parent and a public servant. Her high heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward her son, but she wasn't rushing. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate. She'd handled tense situations before, but this one was different. This wasn't just about being the mayor. This was about being a mother. The officers straightened their postures, recognizing their city's leader. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as this ordinary morning continued to unfold in extraordinary ways. The woman on the porch had finally stopped recording, her phone hanging limply at her side as realization dawned on her face. Morning birds continued their songs overhead, oblivious to the human drama below. A newspaper delivery route had somehow turned into a moment that would spark conversations throughout the community for months to come. The autumn breeze carried the weight of unspoken words, of assumptions made and lessons about to be learned. No one on that street could have predicted how this situation would transform their community. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments, and this morning was about to become a turning point for everyone involved, especially for the woman who had made the call and who was about to learn a powerful lesson about judgment and community. The mayor stepped forward, her presence commanding yet somehow gentle. Her son stood tall beside her, no longer just a paper delivery boy in others' eyes, but the child of the city's most respected leader. The morning sun caught the subtle shine of her badge of office, but it was the warmth in her eyes, not the symbol of authority, that captured everyone's attention. "Good morning, officers," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet street. She greeted each officer by name. She knew most of the force personally from her years of community work. The officers' postures relaxed slightly, but their professional demeanor remained intact. This wasn't just any routine call anymore. This had become a teachable moment for the entire neighborhood. The woman on the porch stood frozen, her phone now clutched tightly against her chest like a shield. The realization that she had just called the police on the mayor's son was sinking in, bringing with it waves of embarrassment and fear. But what she saw in the mayor's face wasn't anger or revenge. It was understanding, tinged with a mother's concern. "I believe we have a misunderstanding here," the mayor said, walking slowly toward the porch. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement, each step measured and purposeful. She wasn't rushing to judgment, wasn't letting emotion override reason. This was a skill she developed over years of handling delicate city matters, but today it was personal in a way she'd never experienced before. The gathering of neighbors had grown larger, but they maintained a respectful distance. Some still wore their morning robes, coffee cups forgotten in their hands. They watched as their mayor, who they'd seen handling city crises on local news, now faced a different kind of challenge right on their street. The boy's delivery bag sat on the curb where he'd left it, newspapers still waiting to be delivered. A reminder of how ordinary this morning had started, how simple tasks could suddenly become complicated by assumptions and fear. The mayor glanced at it, then back at her son, pride visible in her eyes despite the situation. My son has been delivering papers in this neighborhood for over a year, she explained, her voice carrying naturally without having to raise it. He's an honor roll student, volunteers at the community center, and yes, he uses his phone to track his delivery route. She pulled out her own phone, showing the same delivery app her son used. The woman on the porch began to tremble slightly, the reality of her actions hitting her full force. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I just moved here. There have been reports of suspicious activity, I thought. The mayor raised her hand gently, not to silence but to reassure. I understand fear, she said softly. As a mother, as a city leader, and as someone who has experienced prejudice firsthand. But fear should never be the foundation of our community. The officers, reading the situation perfectly, had stepped back slightly. This wasn't a police matter anymore. It had become something more important. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh coffee from nearby houses, a reminder of how ordinary this day should have been. Some of the neighbors had begun to share quiet stories among themselves. About the young paper carrier helping the elderly couple with their groceries. About him finding and returning a lost cat. About his unfailing politeness. These whispered conversations painted a picture very different from the suspicious person described in the police call. The mayor's next words would change everything, not just for the woman on the porch, but for the entire community. She saw an opportunity here, a chance to turn an unfortunate incident into something meaningful. Her years of public service had taught her that sometimes the most powerful changes start in the most unexpected moments. The autumn sun continued to climb higher, casting shorter shadows across the manicured lawns. What had started as a confrontation was about to transform into a conversation that would reshape their community's understanding of prejudice, fear, and the power of open dialogue. The mayor took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of her neighbors and community members. This wasn't a speech at City Hall or a press conference. This was real life, happening on a quiet suburban street, with her own son at the center of it. Her next words needed to come not from a politician, but from her heart. Let me share something with you, she began, her voice gentle, but clear enough for everyone to hear. 20 years ago, before I became mayor, I was just a young mom taking my little boy to the park. Someone called the police because they thought I didn't look like I belonged in that neighborhood. She paused, letting the words sink in. I was wearing a business suit, coming straight from work, but that didn't matter to them. The woman on the porch slowly sank into her porch chair, her phone now forgotten in her lap. Other neighbors had drawn closer, drawn in by the personal story their mayor was sharing. Even the police officers listened intently. This wasn't the kind of training they got at the academy. The difference between then and now isn't just my title, the mayor continued, gesturing to her city pin. It's how we choose to handle these moments. We can let them divide us, or we can use them to understand each other better. She walked up the porch steps, each step deliberate, until she stood face to face with the woman who had called the police on her son. The morning had grown warmer, but no one seemed eager to leave. The young paper carrier still stood by the police car, his delivery bag waiting patiently on the curb. He watched his mother with pride, understanding that this moment was bigger than just him. When you looked out your window this morning, the mayor asked gently, what exactly made you afraid? It wasn't an accusation. It was an invitation to honest dialogue. The kind of conversation that rarely happens in public, but that every community needs. The woman's hands twisted in her lap as she spoke. I moved here from the city after my house was broken into, she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. I was home alone when it happened. Ever since then, I've been scared, all the time. Tears began to well up in her eyes. But I never thought about how my fear might hurt someone else. The mayor nodded understanding, pulling up another porch chair to sit beside her. Fear is a powerful emotion, she said softly. But it's an even more dangerous foundation for building a community. She turned to address all the gathered neighbors. Every one of us has felt like an outsider at some point. Every one of us has made assumptions about others. The question is, what do we do with those feelings? The elderly couple who knew the paper carrier stepped forward, sharing how he had helped them during last winter's big storm. Another neighbor mentioned how he had found and returned their lost dog. Each story added a layer to the picture, showing how community is built through small, everyday actions. This moment, the mayor continued, her voice growing stronger, isn't about shame or blame. It's about growth. About recognizing our fears and biases and choosing to be better. She reached out and gently touched the woman's hand. You're new to our community. Instead of making you feel worse, let's focus on making you feel welcome, the right way. The police officers, sensing the shift in the situation, began to quietly return to their cars. But the mayor wasn't finished. She saw an opportunity here, a chance to turn this morning's incident into something meaningful for the entire community. The sun had risen fully now, casting a warm glow over the gathering. What had started as a frightening confrontation was transforming into something else. A moment of genuine connection and understanding. The mayor's son had resumed his paper route, delivering to the remaining houses while the adults continued their conversation. This morning would be remembered not for the police call, but for what happened after, when a community chose to face its fears and prejudices head-on, guided by a leader who understood that the most powerful changes often start in the most unexpected ways. The porch had become an unexpected space for healing. The woman who had made the call sat with tears streaming down her face, but these weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of release. As neighbors gathered closer, she began to share her story in trembling words. 6 months ago, I was alone in my city apartment when someone broke in, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. I hid in my closet for 2 hours, calling 911 over and over. Ever since then, I've been living in constant fear. She looked up at the mayor, then at the young paper carrier who had resumed his route. I moved here thinking I could escape that fear, but I just brought it with me. The mayor listened with the patience of someone who understood trauma. Other neighbors had pulled up chairs or sat on the porch steps, creating an impromptu community circle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gathering, but the atmosphere had changed from tension to tenderness. After my break-in, the woman continued, I joined every neighborhood watch group I could find. I installed security cameras. I stopped sleeping at night. Her hands twisted in her lap. But all that security didn't make me feel any safer. It just made me more suspicious of everyone. An older woman from across the street spoke up, her voice gentle. When my husband passed away last year, I was terrified to live alone. But it was that young man. She pointed to the paper carrier, who noticed my porch light wasn't working one morning. He changed the bulb for me, and now he checks it every day during his route. The mayor's son paused in his deliveries, a newspaper in hand, listening to the stories being shared about him. He hadn't realized how his small acts of kindness had impacted his neighbors. The woman who had called the police watched him too, seeing him now through different eyes. Fear can make us forget our humanity, the mayor said softly. But it's our connections to each other that help us overcome that fear. She turned to the gathered neighbors. Every person here has a story. Every person has felt afraid, felt like an outsider, felt misunderstood. The question is, how do we move forward? The woman wiped her eyes and sat up straighter. I want to apologize, she said, looking directly at the young paper carrier. Not just with words, but with actions. I want to learn how to be part of this community without letting my fear control me. A retired teacher from down the street raised her hand. We have a community garden project starting next week. Why don't you join us? It's amazing how working together in the dirt can break down barriers. Others began chiming in with invitations, to book clubs, to weekend barbecues, to morning walking groups. The woman who had been so afraid just hours ago found herself overwhelmed by the warmth of genuine connection. The mayor watched with quiet satisfaction as her community did what communities do best: heal through connection. Sometimes, she said, our worst moments can lead to our best opportunities for growth. The young paper carrier had finished his route and returned to the gathering. Without hesitation, he walked up to the porch and held out his hand to the woman who had called the police on him. "Would you like to sign up for a newspaper subscription?" he asked with a gentle smile. "I promise to deliver it to your porch every morning." The laughter that followed wasn't mocking. It was the warm laughter of people recognizing their shared humanity. The woman took his hand, then surprised everyone by standing up and giving him a hug. The morning that had started with suspicion and fear was ending with promise and possibility. The police cars were long gone, but the neighbors stayed, sharing stories and making plans. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was the beginning of real change, starting right here on a suburban porch on an ordinary Saturday morning. Word of what happened that Saturday morning spread through the community like ripples in a pond. The local newspaper, the same one the young teen delivered, ran a front-page story not about conflict, but about connection. The headline read, "A morning call that changed our community." The story caught fire on social media, but not in the way these incidents usually do. Instead of angry comments and divided opinions, people shared their own experiences of misjudgment and healing. The mayor's office was flooded with calls from other cities asking how they could create similar dialogues in their own communities. At the next city council meeting, the chamber was packed with residents who normally never attended. The woman who had made the police call was there too, sitting in the front row. When it was time for public comments, she stood up, her voice shaking but determined. "A week ago, I was the woman who called the police on an innocent young man," she began. The room fell silent. "I could have become another viral video of someone letting their prejudices hurt others. Instead, thanks to the leadership of our mayor and the kindness of our community, I learned a different way forward." People in the audience nodded, some wiping away tears. They weren't just hearing a speech. They were witnessing someone's genuine transformation. The local news cameras captured it all. But this wasn't the kind of sensational story they usually chased. This was about hope and healing. The police department reached out to the mayor, asking her to help develop new training programs. "We need to learn from this," the police chief said during a community meeting. "Sometimes the best way to serve and protect is to stop and listen first." Officers began attending community gatherings not as authority figures, but as neighbors. The young paper carrier's story became a talking point in local schools. Teachers used it to discuss bias and community building with their students. One middle school class even started a random acts of kindness project, inspired by how the teen had helped his elderly customers without being asked. Local businesses got involved too. The coffee shop on the corner started hosting Neighbor Meet Neighbor mornings, where residents could gather and share stories over free coffee. The community center opened its doors for evening discussions about breaking down barriers and building trust. The mayor's son continued his paper route, but now people saw him differently. Not as a threat or a stranger, but as a symbol of change. Other young people in the community started stepping up too, offering to help elderly neighbors with yard work or running errands. They weren't just doing chores, they were building bridges. Religious leaders from different faiths came together, organizing joint community service projects. What happened that morning showed us that fear divides, but understanding unites. One leader said during a joint gathering, "The different congregations started working together on food drives and neighborhood cleanup projects." Local artists created murals celebrating community unity. One particular painting showed diverse hands joined in a circle, with the words "Fear less, love more" written beneath. It became a popular spot for people to gather and talk. Even the real estate agents changed their approach. Instead of just selling houses, they started organizing welcome wagon events where new residents could meet their neighbors. The woman who had made the police call became a regular speaker at these gatherings, sharing her story of fear transformed into fellowship. The local gym offered free self-defense classes, but with a twist. Besides teaching physical techniques, they included discussions about when these skills were actually needed versus when fear was creating unnecessary anxiety. The woman who had made the call attended these classes, learning to distinguish between real threats and unfounded fears. As autumn turned to winter, the community had changed in visible ways. People left their porch lights on at night, not out of fear, but as a symbol of welcome. Neighbors knew each other's names and stories. The morning paper route that had sparked it all had become a symbol of how ordinary moments could lead to extraordinary change. The mayor sat at her desk one evening, looking through the hundreds of emails and letters that had poured in from across the country. Each message shared similar stories of misunderstanding and fear in their own communities. That's when she knew they needed to do more than just talk about change. They needed to create it. With the help of community leaders and everyday citizens, she launched the Know Your Neighbor initiative. But this wasn't just another government program with fancy brochures and boring meetings. This was something different, something real, built from the ground up by people who understood what was at stake. The program started simply enough. Every Saturday morning, the same time the paper route incident had occurred, neighbors would gather for walk and talk sessions. The young paper carrier would lead these walks along his route, showing people how he saw the community, not just as houses and streets, but as a tapestry of lives and stories. The woman who had made the police call became one of the program's most passionate advocates. "I used to peek through my curtains at strangers," she told a group of new residents. "Now I sit on my porch and wave to neighbors." Her transformation wasn't just about feeling safer, it was about feeling connected. Local teens who did yard work or babysat in the neighborhood were given special badges, not to mark them as approved, but to celebrate their role in community building. The badges became a source of pride, worn by young people who understood they were more than just workers, they were bridge builders. The program expanded to include Sunday suppers, where families would host meals for neighbors they didn't know well. These weren't formal dinner parties, but casual gatherings where people could share food and stories. One elderly resident noted, "I've lived here for 40 years, but I've never felt more at home than I do now." Schools got involved too, creating neighborhood hero projects where students interviewed local residents about their lives and contributions to the community. The young paper carrier's story was just one of many that showed how small actions could make big differences. The local library started a human library program, where community members could sign up to be books that others could check out for conversation. People shared their experiences of overcoming prejudice, dealing with fear, and finding connection. The woman who made the police call became one of the most requested books. Business owners joined in, offering their spaces for community gatherings. The local cafe hosted coffee with cops sessions, but with a twist. Officers would serve coffee to residents, creating natural opportunities for casual conversation. These meetings helped break down barriers between law enforcement and the community. The mayor's son suggested adding a technology component, creating a neighborhood app that went beyond just reporting suspicious activity. Instead, it highlighted positive community interactions and opportunities to help neighbors. "We need to use our phones to build bridges, not barriers," he explained during a community meeting. Senior citizens were paired with teenage helpers for regular check-ins and assistance. These weren't just service relationships, they became genuine friendships. One elderly man taught his young helper how to play chess, while she showed him how to video chat with his grandchildren. The program even included a new neighbor welcome committee, but it wasn't about bringing casseroles. It was about sharing the community's story of transformation and inviting new residents to be part of it. The woman who had made the police call always spoke at these welcomes, her story serving as both a warning and a promise of how things could be different. Monthly community dinners became a regular event, held in different locations each time: parks, community centers, schools, and even closed-off streets. These weren't just meals. They were celebrations of how far they'd come and reminders of why they needed to keep going. As winter approached, The program had become more than just an initiative. It had become a movement. Other cities sent representatives to learn how they could replicate its success. But as the mayor often said, you can't just copy a program. You have to build real connections, one neighbor at a time. 6 months after that fateful Saturday morning, the community gathered for a special celebration in the town square. The autumn leaves were falling again, bringing back memories of the day that had changed everything. But this time, instead of police sirens and tension, the air was filled with music and laughter. The woman who had made the police call stood at the microphone, looking out at hundreds of familiar faces. Faces that 6 months ago had been strangers she feared. Her hands didn't shake anymore when she spoke in public. Her voice carried strength and warmth as she shared her story for the 100th time, but somehow it still felt fresh and powerful. 6 months ago, I was trapped in a prison of my own fear, she said, her words touching hearts across the crowd. I looked out my window and saw threats instead of neighbors. I used my phone to call the police instead of making connections. She paused, smiling at the young paper carrier sitting in the front row. Now I use that same phone to organize community events and check on elderly neighbors. The crowd included people from neighboring cities and even other states, all drawn by the story of how one community had turned a potential crisis into an opportunity for growth. News cameras rolled, not looking for scandal, but hoping to capture the secret of real change. The mayor's son still delivered papers every morning, but his route had become something of a community tradition. Different neighbors would join him each day, not because he needed help, but because these walks had become a cherished time for connection and conversation. Even in rain or snow, someone would always show up to walk with him. The Know Your Neighbor program had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a response to one incident had grown into a model for community transformation. Other cities weren't just copying the program, they were sending people to learn the heart behind it. The woman who had made the call now worked part-time at the community center, helping other people work through their fears and prejudices. Sometimes the person who seems least likely to help is exactly the one who understands the journey best, she would say to skeptical participants. Local businesses had transformed too. The coffee shop that used to have no loitering signs now had comfortable chairs on the sidewalk with a sign reading, "Sit and stay. Meet a neighbor today." The pharmacy started a program where teens would deliver medications to elderly residents, creating more opportunities for connection. The police department had become a national model for community engagement. Officers were trained not just in law enforcement, but in community building. The police chief often said, "Our best weapon isn't our guns or badges. It's our ability to listen and understand." Children in the community grew up seeing something different from what the news usually showed. They saw people of different backgrounds not just tolerating each other, but genuinely caring for one another. They learned that fear could be transformed into friendship, that mistakes could lead to growth. The young paper carrier had grown too. Now in his final year of high school, he was helping train other young people to take over his route. "It's not just about delivering papers," he would tell them. "It's about delivering hope, one house at a time." As the celebration continued in the town square, the mayor watched with pride as her son and the woman who had called the police on him 6 months ago worked together, serving food to the gathered crowd. They moved with the easy familiarity of old friends, their laughter genuine and warm. The autumn sun set on the gathering, casting long shadows across the square, but no one felt afraid of the growing darkness. Porch lights began to flick on across the neighborhood, not as security measures, but as beacons of welcome. The community had learned that the opposite of fear isn't courage, it's connection. They had discovered that the best security system isn't cameras or locks, but neighbors who know and care for each other. What started as a moment of prejudice had become a movement of love, proving that sometimes the best changes start with the hardest moments.